When I was in college, a friend of mine had a mental breakdown. He stayed up nights, many nights in a row, wandering around, a big smile on his face, talking to anyone he would meet. And one day during this manic episode, we were in his apartment, and he led me over to a shelf, and he pointed to it and said, "See? See?" On the shelf were a book and a bottle, maybe a couple of pens. To my eyes, nothing out of the ordinary. I cautiously inquired as he just pointed and said, "Don't you see?" Had I been on some hallucinogenic or something, maybe I would have seen, but I wasn't and I didn't. I saw a book and a bottle and pens. But to his eyes, he saw something majestic, something beautiful, artistic, something holy on a shrine of sorts. In this state that he was in, he could also speak fluent languages that he and I had only spent a year learning. And under normal circumstances, we were like 6-year-olds in that language. Something opened up in him, something holy. I have wished to see the world like that at times, like he saw it at that moment. And at times I have special moments when things open, when the majesty of simple things appear, the dust floating through a shaft of sun breaking through the early morning bedroom window, the mushrooms blooming on my neighbor's yard like little umbrellas of joy, the amazing crash of a falling branch I just happened to see. But all these things are nature. They are not books and pencils and bottles, just right hand of God kind of moments. I think it's easier to be redeemed in this way from our cynical moods and our inattention by natural occurrences, by mushrooms and sunlight and thunder and lightning. The more we feel separate from it, the more we feel connected to it. The lightning strikes that light up the sky, the wind in the pecan trees, the frog in the creek all point beyond us in ways that pencils and bottles rarely do. And we have legends of being redeemed by nature, especially in our faith. The most obvious and most talked of is Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson, the so-called conquered sage, was born and bred in Unitarian Universalism, really Unitarianism at the time in the 1800s. He became a Unitarian minister. He left the ministry and was only just beginning to make his mark as a figurehead in transcendentalism in 1842 when his son died. You may have heard this story before. Young Waldo Emerson was the first son of Ralph and Lydian. Waldo succumbed to scarlet fever. Wally was his nickname. He was 5 years old. Now, Emerson had known something about grief, having lost his first wife when she was only 20. He was deeply affected by death and by the death of his son, who he referred to as the world's wonderful child. Of him, Emerson said, he was too precocious and precious and unique a creation to be huddled aside into the waste and prodigality of things. Emerson spent much of that spring composing a memorial poem to his son. The poem Threnody serves as a biography of the boy's short life and particularly of the potential wasted by his death. Here's the poem, or part of it, that he wrote. Not mine, I never called thee mine, but nature's heir. If I repine in seeing rashly torn and moved, not what I made, but what I loved. Grow early old with grief that thou must to the wastes of nature go. 'Tis because a general hope was quenched and all must doubt and grope. And Wally's poem, which is written on his gravestone at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, which many members of our church have visited, the final stanza says this: the hyacinthine boy for whom morn well might break, and April bloom, the gracious boy who did adorn the world whereinto he was born. The scholar Philip Gura noted that Wally's death was an event that marked a decisive shift in Emerson's life and philosophy. I imagine Emerson turned himself toward the forests of Concord and the nature that surrounded him as a way of restoring his soul. That he made a shift further from a theology that God was only in the stories of the Bible to the fact that God was in everything for him. For Emerson, God was central to his life. God was everywhere for him. He said he reappears with all his parts in every moss and cobweb. God was always present in every soul, in every deed, in every relationship that Emerson had. He said, "It is by yourself without ambassador that God speaks to you." For Emerson, the whole could be seen in nature, which was to him an endless source of delight, a place of universal relations, of essences unchanged by man. Nature was wild and pure. It was exhilarating. Emerson saw God expressed there and human beings part of nature, mostly expressing God's love for the world. As he walked in the healing Concord woods, which were to him, he said, a cathedral, he would write, "As atmosphere surrounds us, so are we surrounded by the power of God." He ceased to believe in the anthropocentric scheme of salvation portrayed in the Bible. The universe was much more vast than the biblical writers had ever imagined, Emerson would say. Emerson's response to nature was to say, "I will lift up my hands and say, cosmos," as if to praise God. The whole of nature, said Emerson, was a metaphor for the human mind. The whole is much larger than he thought, but that whole is still present in the human mind. So Emerson embraced one of nature's most valuable lessons, listening. Nature, he said, does not argue. She hints or she states. You can follow the hint where it leads or accept the statement if you can, but you do not incur the risk of misleading and the heat of an argument. Emerson's first book, Nature, was a groundbreaking investigation into these concepts. I know many of you have explored it. In one of his journals in 1840, Emerson recorded an amazing capstone to this new theology that he was entering into. In October of 1840, he wrote this: "I dreamed that I floated at will in the great ether, and I saw this world floating also, not far off, but diminished to the size of an apple. Then an angel took it in his hand and brought it to me and said, 'This must thou eat.' And I ate the world." Scholars have said that this is like Emerson's global Eucharist. He had come to take communion at last, not in the church, but in the universe. Emerson had discovered a great truth, that the inner reaches of his own soul were as vast as the universe. He realized that we all carry the world and the universe within us, but each of us must come to know it for ourselves. For Emerson, a man stricken by grief, loss, life changes, diseases that killed his family, career changes, a world at the edge of war, eating the apple was Emerson's version of the temptation in the Garden of Eden. This time, not out of ignorance and innocence, but out of knowledge and intuition of our connection to the whole of creation. So Emerson, as our model for today, points to the idea that to know that we are connected to all that is, that the laws of nature and the laws of love are in us, is to know the basis of all religion and morality and our relation to the ultimate source of existence, to God. What could be more expressive of this realization than to say, I ate the world? You see, Emerson turned his loss into love, to seeing the holy and the common, not only in nature, but in the pen and the bottle and the book, as well as the pine and the hedgehog and the rain. And in being redeemed from his loss by nature and understanding God was in all things, he turned his belief on each of us, because he also believed in the law of love, that there is some good in everything. He said, in the darkest, meanest things, there always, always is something that sings. I have to work hard at remembering that God is in all things, that has purpose for me, that has a redeeming quality for me. I don't have to work hard in knowing that God has a purpose for me, but that the idea of God in all things has a purpose. The symbol God can offer a vision of the highest values of truth, justice, love, goodness toward which I strive. It's a standard against which to measure myself and my achievements. It can remind me of the relativity and the limitations of my own ideas and be a focus for personal devotion and communal worship, even in the dichotomies of wanting a God that is personal and knowing a God that is abstract, as our reading put it. This is why the idea of God in any form is important to me. I walked through a hardware store recently looking for some string, and I remembered the poem. I passed the hammers and the pliers and the mailboxes and the hoses and the caulk, and I missed something in my hurry to get my list of chores over with. I missed God in those things, in the hammers that were pointing east like steel woodpeckers of the future, and dozens of hinges opening their brass wings and rakes shyly fanning their toes. I admit to you that in my hurry, it was easier to see God and the majesty of the lightning strikes outside the store than in those things inside the store. But next time, I promise I will remember the wonder of the world is in everything, God. And I will remember the poet's meaning that we can take delight in knowing that every bit of despair and absent things in our lives can be repaired and patched. And maybe like the poet, I will stand in aisle 4 among the lug nuts and the wood screws and proclaim the greatness of the world. And when I doubt the existence of God, I might remember that a small store can be a straightforward answer to such difficult problems in our lives. That maybe the poet and our ability to light up the things we encounter in the world in an electric and ecstatic way is the proof of God that we need. And I will remember her words. In a world not perfect, but not bad either. Let there be glue and glaze and gum and grabs, caulk and hooks and shackles, cables and slips, and signs so spare a child may read them: men, women, in, out, no parking, beware the dog. In the right hands, she says, they can work wonders. Maybe today or this week, you might build an altar of ordinary things to meditate on. Maybe walk through a hardware store and be redeemed from your despair or your loneliness. Or take a moment and stare into the faces of the world's creations that have less obvious majesty than amazing lightning or torrential downpours or beautiful trees or small mushrooms on your neighbor's yard. Maybe taking a moment to encounter the beauty and the majesty of ordinary things in your life will do you good. I know it has done me good this week. My friends, I wish you well this week. May you know the blessing of the ordinary kind, the ordinary things that redeem us every day. Amen.